Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my Total War Warhammer video on what the Old World Edition means for the future of DLC, free DLC, and the upcoming sequels for Total War Warhammer. Now, as many of you know, earlier on this week, Total War Warhammer, the Old World Edition, became available, effectively making Bretonnia the last new playable race in the game as we know it at the moment. Essentially what the Old World Edition is kind of a bow wrapping up Total War Warhammer. Called it the Old World Edition because they didn't want to go through calling the games Total War Warhammer 1, 2, and 3, or Total War Warhammer Even More Hammer, or Max Hammer Total War Warhammer, or any other ridiculous names one could think of for a sequel. So this one is going to be called Old World. I imagine the next one is going to be called the New World Edition, and the last one, probably focusing on the armies of chaos, is going to be called the Chaos Edition, or something along those lines. So it's really just to smooth out that entire process of sequel naming, and just to essentially release a Game of the Year edition without making it a Game of the Year edition, without necessarily including all the different DLCs that have come out so far. Now, with the release of the Old World Edition, there's been a number of press interviews going out and articles published around the future of Total War Warhammer and what the future looks like for the game series as a whole. A few people have been a little bit concerned with the title, the Old World Edition, and the fact that CA have kind of implied that there's no major further DLC coming out for this edition of the game, and that they've really moved all their resources to working on the sequel, which they've been working on already for quite some time, and I imagine we'll probably see out towards the beginning of next year or even the end of this one, to be honest. I will state that that's not to say that there's not going to be any more DLC for the game, but I'll get into my ideas about that a little bit later in this video. Some of the articles took a bit of a weird twist on this whole Old World Edition thing, and the fact that it went released by CA saying we're leaving the Old World behind, and some reporter, maybe it was just one article I saw, but there may be others out there, that said, oh, the Old World Edition may mean that they are leaving behind fantasy to move on to Age of Sigmar. But no, he just said that for clickbait, to get you guys to respond in uproar in the comment section of his article. That's no way, in any way, shape, or form going to happen, and I realize I'm being slightly hypocritical by even bringing it up in my video, so apologies for that. But essentially, he only brought that up to kick off a fight in the comment section of his article to get it to trend, or however his website functions, to get it have a few more clicks and what have you. But no, Age of Sigmar is not coming to Total War Warhammer. I would bet my life on it. So in that way, it's really important to understand what we mean by the Old World Edition. Now, the Old World is kind of taken from our use of the Old World in our own history, when we found the New World being the Americas. But the Old World, really, looking at a map of the Warhammer world here, is just this area here. It's not even including the entirety of the sort of what would be Africa, essentially, of the Warhammer world and the Far East. It's just essentially what is Europe in the Warhammer world. And that's it. That's the only section that's covered by really this kind of fairly broad title of the Old World as it stands. It's kind of everything from Barak Var north, but including Tilia and Estalia and all that, along the World's Edge Mountains and stopping at the ocean. It's that kind of box. And that's really what we got with the game. Here's sort of a detailed game map of all the different areas, and they really did deliver the Old World. There are, however, some notable exceptions to this and a few things missing. I'd say the most sort of blatant thing missing, and the thing that probably has most people anxious, is the lack of Skaven. No Skaven. Skaven definitely a huge feature in the Old World as it stands, with the Under Empire being a hugely sort of powerful entity waiting to emerge from underground and take over the world. Also, no Kislev, no Halflings, no Dogs of War, no mercenaries down in the Border Princes, Tilia and Estalia. Those are really the major aspects that are missing to the game as it stands in the Old World. Now, unfortunately, what the Old World Edition does mean is we are likely not going to be seeing these factions or units added to the game at this juncture. It may be brought in later. Personally, I see Skaven being introduced in the next game. I actually now, because we're moving away to the New World, I actually don't really see Kislev or the Dogs of War being introduced until the third iteration of the game, which looks like it's going to focus on the Chaos factions, and thusly the Chaos Waste, which slightly brings us back to the Old World and the northern regions of the Old World. And that's when I think we might see Kislev introduced to the Old World and the game itself as a separate faction, to make it something a bit more interesting to fight against you as Chaos, or to have an interesting campaign fighting against Chaos from that perspective. Now, there are a couple of other things in the game that's been missing that we've been promised. So along with the DLC not having any more major races, I, however, personally believe that there will be more DLC for the game, but just not of major races. I think there may be at least one more Legendary Lord package, but I'm going to get into that in a little bit more detail as we go on. But another thing missing from the free DLC is, of course, the intonation of the old friend. Now, here we can see a list of the stuff they've released, and it's mostly gone in line with what they said they would release for the game and for the free DLC at the launch of Total War Warhammer. And as we see, the new race, Bretonia, has been added. The new lord there was a Vampire Count Lord. You can always tell what faction it's going to be by the background, and that's very much vampire architecture. So we got Isabella, and the next one is an old friend, and we can very obviously see an empire building there, and it's most likely going to be empire related. And for me, it's a no-brainer. People have speculated about this a lot, but for me, it's going to be Boris. It's going to be Boris Todbringer and Middenland as a faction. Now, why do I think this? Well, it's been heavily hinted at. Middenland itself was given campaign stats. The Middenland Runefang is a unique item, giving campaign stats, as well as Middenland becoming a faction in Total War Warhammer. Now, they took away all the Sigmarite stuff, and they essentially made an Empire roster out of that. Now, essentially, what you're looking to add to make a Middenland faction at the bare minimum are Knights Panther, Knights of the White Wolf, Priests of Ulrich, and for me, Huntsmen of the Drakwold. So just bow units for Middenland to have as well. I think those are the units you'd need to add at a bare minimum to make the faction, and that's not a huge amount for them to add to the game. For a bit of details on all the Middenland stuff, do check out my Middenland lore video, which will pop up in the right-hand corner around now, or will be available through a link in the description. So for me, it's a no-brainer. Boris is going to be the old friend that we see added at the end of the game. Now, with most of their free DLC, it was added in conjunction with some DLC. But what DLC would they add to the game at this point? Now, there are a couple of things we can consider for the DLC that the old friend might come with, if indeed there is one. There is the possibility they just release it on its own, but 2 batches of free DLC with nothing else coming along seems slightly unlikely considering they just gave us Bretonia. So they might try and get those last couple of dollars out of us with a little DLC around Legendary Lords. So I see a Legendary Lord possibility. Now, also, I'd like to refer us back to the Russian leak. If you guys haven't seen the Russian leak, let me fill you in. Essentially, the Russian leak is a data mining bit of information that came out when the game first launched. It gave us a bit of an overview of the map and how the map looks like it will be attached to other parts of the world with games that will be added later. And it gave us a rundown of the races added to the game and the order in which they'll be added, and a number attributed to the DLC next to it. Now, the numbers of the DLCs have been slightly thrown off, depending on your interpretation of what's a DLC, what's not, and just thrown off in general, even if you had an accurate count up until a point. But the races have all appeared in the right order. And in that list, the next ones up are the Tomb Kings. And then after the Tomb Kings is Skaven. Now, obviously, things change, and with the vast success of Total War Warhammer, Creative Assembly have looked to try and adapt their plans for the game, but for the most part, they've still stuck to that list as it stands at the moment. With Bretonia coming out, was meant to be coming out towards the end of the year, but coming out a little bit later than planned, just to wrap up a kind of Game of the Year edition for them, it seems. So this DLC, I don't think is going to be one of these 2 races. It isn't going to be Tomb Kings, it isn't going to be Skaven. So for me, it's going to be a DLC for DLC. Now, that might have some people up in arms, but if you throw in some of the missing Legendary Lords for some of the DLC factions we've had so far, I'm happy. If you give me an Ariel of the Wood Elves, a Thorox the Brass Bull, and a Wulfric for Chaos, and you chuck them all into the same package, I'll buy that package. I probably will. You can probably have my money now. But they might be a little bit scared of the perception of a DLC for DLC. And so that might make them a bit cautious. And that's why we might not see this and might just have Boris released for a freebie later on. But I'd actually quite like to have at least one more DLC out of them before the new game comes out. And there are Legendary Lords missing who are fantastic and would look great on the game. Now, let's have a look at some of the interview information we got for the game. And I'm just going to read this quote. The next 2 Warhammer games will be standalone releases with their own campaign maps, and each will have a quartet of starting factions exactly like the first, in the words of the brand director, Robert Bartholomew. He also told us that the future maps will be as big or bigger than that of the first game, and that the sequels will also be supported by DLC and free DLC, presumably supplied by the new content team, which is a team they have working at the studio. Now, if we consider that this is the area of the Warhammer world covered by the first game, as I pointed out earlier, this is the likely venue for the second game, And this comes down to the Russian leak as well, which outlined that the second game would have the High Elves, the Dark Elves, and the Lizard Men. And the High Elves living on the island of Ulthuan, the Dark Elves in Nagaroth, and the Lizard Men live in the Southlands as well as Lustria, but their main headquarters are their main sort of larger settlements, I believe, and headquarters and sort of most important locations are in Lustria. So this would be the New World edition of the map. Now, the third game is focusing on the Chaos factions, so that would suggest that we'd have Chaos outlined here. And there are Chaos Wastes on both poles, so there are Chaos Wastes in the south and Chaos Wastes in the north. And these are the locations of the games, really, of the 3 different games. Now, you may notice that in the statement I read you guys just a moment ago, it said there was going to be a quartet of species released for every game. Now, you may notice in the second iteration of the game, the only races that were mentioned in the leak were the High Elves, the Dark Elves, and the Lizard Men, which opens up a spot for a 4th race. Now, as we know, the next races up on that DLC schedule are the Tomb Kings, which are essentially Egyptian mummies, and an army of Egyptian mummies, for those of you who don't know. It's a lot more complicated than that, but just to give you sort of a rough notion of what they are. And the Skaven, essentially a huge faction of rat men. One of these races looks likely to fill that gap of the last spot to make up the quartet of the second game. Now, another point I want to raise with that Russian leak is we also got this map. Now, this is a very squished in map of the potential Total War Warhammer world. Now, it brings everything in a little bit tighter than it would necessarily need to be. And essentially what this map does is it still provides all the major regions, but it's a bit too cramped for my own personal liking. I'm just going to get my mouse out here for you guys for a bit just to point out a couple of things. Essentially what we'd have is we'd still have Ulthuan here, the home of the High Elves. I hope you guys can see that okay. Here would be Nagaroth, the region of the Dark Elves. Here would be Lustria, the region of the Lizard Men. And here would be the Land of the Dead, otherwise known as the region of the Tomb Kings, and Araby as well, which is a kind of human civilization that exists kind of around this area of the frontier. And in the back here, we'd have the Darklands and the Ogre Kingdoms. Now, this map doesn't really do a lot of justice to these areas and how big they can be. Yes, we get the elves quite nicely, but Lustria is very much, the area of the Lizard Men is very much cut out there, as well as Araby and essentially what equates to Africa in the Warhammer world, which is another huge territory which is lived in by the Lizard Men, known as the Southland. Now, this map opens up kind of a crossroads for me in terms of what might be happening next with the sequels of Total War Warhammer. If the map actually sticks with this, and they stick to the same size, and they stick to the proportions and the way this map is laid out, there's a couple of predictions I can make in terms of the way the franchise is going to go in the future. But if they do sort of expand this map and make it slightly more ambitious, as they've said they're looking to do with the game, because it has done so well for them financially, they are very much looking to expand the ambition of the game, which hopefully translates into an expanded map as such. Now, I'm not saying expand into the unexplored areas really of the Warhammer world, which is really the Far East, sort of Nippon and Ind and all those regions that are never really built up in terms of the lore of Warhammer. But at least sort of expand the Darklands out, expand Araby into the Southlands and make that an entire continent, and give us the whole of Lustria. I understand that the sort of west side of Nagaroth there's not a lot going on there, but at least give us like a little bit more of Nagaroth leading into the world there. And I think with the technology, it shouldn't be hard, because these are just placeholders one has to imagine in the first iteration of the game, and it wouldn't be hard to add other territories and change the shape of the map as it existed upon its release. So let's go through the first scenario. If Creative Assembly look to expand the world map south of Araby and open up the Southlands for colonization, I see the second game taking shape like this. We'll get Ulthuan, Nagaroth, as we saw on the map earlier, and Lustria, but we'll also incorporate the Southlands and Araby into the second game, because if you incorporate the Southlands, you may as well just throw Araby in there and connect and build a land bridge up into the old world. If this is the case, what I see happening is we'll get High Elves, Dark Elves, Lizard Men, and Tomb Kings as the 4 major races of Total War Warhammer 2. Now, bear with me, all you Skaven fans, before you start bombarding the comments. I see Skaven as the 5th race, playing a very similar role to what Chaos played in the first game. So Skaven and the Vermintide will be the big bad in the second game, emerging all over these new areas and taking them down. And really, Skaven are one of the few things that could really threaten all of these areas at once. One could argue Chaos as well, but we already have Chaos in the game as it stands. So I think Skaven will be the big bad for the second game, and they may do something similar, whereas Skaven's a 5th race, but Skaven, because of its popularity, is what they'll use to drive pre-orders. Now, with the sort of outcry of the Chaos pre-order not being available after the release of the game, they may have learned their lesson, but I still don't think Creative Assembly are done with pre-orders. So I think what we'll get is they'll do what they did towards the back end of the Chaos DLC, and say, look, if you pre-order and up to a week after the game's release, you buy the game in that time period, you'll get to play as Skaven. Otherwise, Skaven will be the race that turns up that just attacks everywhere at once and is the big apocalyptic event at the end of the campaign of the second game. Let me know if you guys think differently, because I could see Skaven very much being the big bad, at least for the lizard men, and then obviously the dark elves being the big bad for the elves up in the northern part of the game. And that's the way I see the second game playing out if they expand the map. We'll get Araby included, we'll get the Southlands included, we'll have Nagaroth, Lustria, and Ulthuan included as well. Now that leaves a couple of areas attended to. Now, we could get the Chaos Wastes north and south if they do expand the map out, because then you'll have Chaos being able to charge up the Southlands and attacking Lustria as well. And you have the Chaos Wastes in north being expanded upon. Now, many of you may not know, if you're just new to the Warhammer world through Total War Warhammer, there are actually fortresses and buildings and settlements up in the Chaos Wastes. There's a lot of messed up stuff that happens in them, but they do exist. So the expansion of Chaos will hopefully see an actual building structure, maybe not dissimilar to that of the elf system we have at the moment. For a bit more information on my thoughts on that, do look at my Total War Warhammer 2 regional occupation video. I'll pop up a link in the corner and I'll put one in the description for you as well. That has sort of more in-depth analysis of what I think Chaos settlements and things might look like come the third game. But that leaves a couple of regions unattended to. That leaves the Darklands for the Chaos dwarves, and the Ogre Kingdoms for the Ogres, which are, again, needing map expansions. Now, they might just be thrown in with the Chaos Wastes North and South as part of their game, or they might be separate expansions on their own. In the leak, they were listed as DLC, but with the idea of the quartet being an established thing for all of the games that they have coming out in terms of the expansions or the sequels, whatever you prefer to call them, it seems that the dwarves and the ogres will be superfluous to any sort of sets of 4. The sets of 4 in the next game being, in this scenario, the Lizard Men, the Tomb Kings, the High Elves, the Dark Elves, and in the next one being the 4 demon armies of Chaos, one representing each Chaos god. So the Dwarves and the Ogres would definitely be DLC, and maybe have to have the DLC with map expansions as well. The other scenario is they don't expand the map as we've seen it with the leaked information from the data mining. Now that would present a very different issue. Essentially, in that case, what we'd get is everything on the left-hand side of that map, so Ulthuan, Nagaroth, and Lustria, would be the High Elves, the Dark Elves, the Lizard Men, and in that scenario, with just this being the map, and the old world being separated by an ocean, I see Skaven being the 4th race, and there maybe not being a 5th race whatsoever, and Araby and the Lands of the Dead being a separate expansion as well. So in the scenario where that map isn't expanded, those are the 4 races I think we'll see. We'll have Skaven as one of the quartet, rather than an additional bad guy, and the Tomb Kings would have to be a separate map expansion, very much like I mentioned for the Chaos Dwarves and for the Ogre Kingdoms. Now what this does present an interesting scenario is, there are 3 games planned, and then if they don't expand the map, we do have these 3 races which need their own geographical areas, which don't have their own geographical areas, and maybe one could imply by that perhaps there's a chance of a kind of little expansion to each one of the iterations of the game, wherein they add in one of the races who need a map. So we might, there's a very slim chance, but you know, the optimist in me, and I don't really believe this will happen, but the optimist in me thinks that, okay, so we've got 3 separate races that need 3 distinct areas of map that don't fit in with the grander plan of the trilogy of games. Maybe you give each game a separate expansion, and the next one up, according to the leak, is the Tomb Kings, which may suggest that between now and the second game, we get a Tomb King expansion, which might see the introduction as a free LC of Midland. But that's my 100-to-1 shout. I think that's unlikely. And the Tomb Kings, if they do turn up, will probably be an expansion of the second game. But you'd have to build a separate landmass if you don't expand that map outwards. You'll also notice if we don't expand that map outwards, we won't really get introduced to the Southern Wastes and the Chaos Wastes in the south of the lands. And we won't really get a lot of Chaos versus Lizard Men fights going on from that way, and giving us a faction of Chaos in the south, which would be a great shame in my view. But this is an alternative scenario of what might happen with the future Total War Warhammer games, as we know them, as they've been laid out in the leaks, and as they've kind of discussed through all these news articles. And that about wraps it up for the implications of the Total War Warhammer Old Edition game. I hope you guys found that interesting. Let me know if you agree or disagree with me on any of my points, but I am looking forward to the way the game's going. I do hope that we do get the Tomb King land added in some way, and as the Total War Old World Edition essentially means the end of any major DLCs, I doubt we'll get the Tomb Kings in the expansion with the first one, but as I said, that's my 100-to-1 shout. Other than that, guys, I do hope we get at least one more DLC package, because the DLC factions need their regiments of renown and need a couple more legendary lords. So that's really what I'd like to see the final package be for Total War Warhammer: regiments of renown for Beastmen, Wood Elves, and Chaos, and a couple, if not, and at least one, if not a couple of legendary lords each for each one of those factions. That would be pretty great. And you know what? If you're going to make it paid, chuck in another Bretonnian lord. Why not? But that's really what I'd love to see from the game so far. And those are my thoughts on it going forward. Hope you found that informative. And thanks very much for joining me on this one. Do please subscribe, guys, for more Total War Warhammer content and more content on other sort of role-playing and strategy games. Thanks again for joining me, and hope you all have a great day.